One of my favorite games is Europa Universalis 4 by Paradox. It is a grand strategy game where you can play as any country, or technically non-country, but you work with the game mechanics you have, that existed at its start date of November 11th, 1444. One of the most interesting dynamics in the game for me is how a war I have started against Austria will pull in their ally Poland, which ultimately leads to Poland's territorial collapse as another country like Hungary, Ottomans, or Muscovy take advantage of the situation. This isn't just something that happens in video games. There have been plenty of times in history where very similar dynamics have come into play, leading to a country's leadership or even an empire collapsing. One such situation is what I am talking about today, how Hamas's attack on Israel in fall of 2023 ultimately led to the Assad government of Syria's collapse in the fall of 2024. Before I begin, I want to preface by saying I'm approaching these situations from an international politics, foreign policy, and geopolitical perspective. In this realm, the morality of the players and situations isn't a motivating factor. As I have said before, in a phrase I borrow from Belle of the Ranch, foreign policy isn't about morality, it's about power. So be aware, that is how I am approaching this going in. Syria had been in a state of civil war going back to the Arab Spring. The start date is treated as March 2011, but precursor events had been happening for months. Between 2020 and 2024, there was effectively a ceasefire between the various factions, and the general assessment was that Bashar al-Assad had managed to retain power. His primary outside backers through this conflict were Russia and Iran, the latter of which also encouraged Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, to fight in Syria on Assad's behalf. It is important to note that this is a massive simplification of the conflict, and there were, and are, other players involved, state and non-state alike. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the USA, ISIS, Kurdish militias, and many, many others. For this video, I am focusing on the most important players connecting Hamas attacks Israel to Assad's government collapses. Cool? Cool. Russia and Iran were the two countries that gave Assad the most on-the-ground support, not only during the civil war, but for decades beforehand. Hafez al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, had signed the original Mediterranean military bases to Russia back in 1971, when they were leased to the USSR. For Russia's part, the continuation of that alliance is critical to their international power projection by providing ports within the Mediterranean, hence Russia's staunch support of Assad. As for the alliance between Iran and Syria, that goes back to the 1980s. Hafez al-Assad chose to support Iran after Iraq, newly led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran in 1980. In that support, Syria shut down the Kirkuk-Banias pipeline to deprive Iraq of oil revenues and provided Iran with Soviet-produced Scud missiles. In exchange, Iran provided free and discounted oil, as well as military advisors through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, to Syria. From these foundations, Syria became increasingly reliant on Iran, not only with billions of dollars being invested in the Syrian economy, but with a reversal of fortunes and that it became Iran providing military hardware to Syria. It was also this relationship that started the Iranian-led Axis of Resistance. The Axis of Resistance are mostly non-state actors that are Iranian-backed, not necessarily Iranian-led, who have the uniting cause of countering United States and Israeli influence. However, all of these groups have their own geopolitical and foreign policy agendas. The most notable of the Axis of Resistance members are Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza, though there are also Iranian-led militias in Iraq, and prior to the Assad government's collapse, included the country of Syria as well. Interesting side note, the name Axis of Resistance actually originates from George W. Bush's term Axis of Evil that he used to describe Iran, Iraq, and North Korea in the lead-up to the Iraq War. It was pointed out by a Libyan newspaper that the only thing these three countries had in common was resistance to US hegemony. The phrase was subsequently picked up by Iranian newspapers in 2004 to describe the Shia militia resistance in Iraq, before being subsequently used for the entire Iranian-led coalition, whose prominent members I listed previously. It is ultimately the connections within this coalition that led to Bashar al-Assad's downfall. Now, all of the different groups that I mentioned have their separate interests while receiving varying levels of support and being under varying levels of control from Iran. On the high end of control from Iran are Hezbollah and some of the Shia militias in Iraq. On the low end of control from Iran are the Houthis and Hamas. The last of these is particularly notable, as Hamas is the only member of the axis of resistance I have listed that isn't Shia. They are Sunni. It is the shared hostility towards Israel that brought Hamas into the coalition. So when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, one of the big questions was what the rest of the axis of resistance was going to do. The thing pretty much everyone wanted to avoid was the whole coalition getting directly involved, as it would almost certainly spark an expanding regional war. As for the axis of resistance members, they largely approached the situation on the basis of what would benefit themselves, with one major exception, which I'll get to shortly. Shia militias in Iraq couldn't really get involved aside from firing rockets. Syria couldn't really get involved, even if Assad wanted to, as it was still recovering from its civil war, with swaths of the country still not under his direct control. Houthi did in essence declare war on Israel, launching missiles and drones toward the country, most of which were shot down, before switching to targeting ships in the Red Sea they claimed were associated with Israel. Many of the ships targeted were not, in fact, associated with Israel, but regardless, it did trigger US involvement in retaliatory bombings in Yemen, which, shockingly, led to the Houthi government to announce they would expand targeting to US ships. This brings us to Hezbollah, who in the weeks and months after Hamas's attack on Israel did fire many rockets into the country, and they almost certainly wanted to get more directly involved. However, Iran did not want Hezbollah directly involved in the conflict and used their influence to keep them largely on the sidelines. If it had been within Iran's power, they probably would have prevented Houthi targeting of international shipping as well. The reason? Iran didn't want a wider war, just like everyone else. And when it comes to Hezbollah in particular, there is a very good reason. Hezbollah is Iran's check on Israel. Both Iran and Israel see the other as an existential threat. Both countries have the military capability of striking the other, though Israel's capability is much greater. But since the establishment of Hezbollah, Iran has provided the group with substantial stockpiles of rockets, with some estimates in 2023 surpassing 100,000. If Israel were to launch an extensive strike on Iran, Hezbollah could retaliate with rays of rockets against Israel, overwhelming the Iron Dome and other defenses. Therefore, Iran didn't want Hezbollah to engage Israel in the aftermath of Hamas's attack because they didn't want to risk losing this deterrent. In addition to the aforementioned, Iran didn't want the conflict to escalate further. Which does bring up another question. Why didn't Iran want the conflict to escalate? If Israel is an existential threat, wouldn't this have been an opportunity to do something about it? Well, contrary to what many people think, Iran's leadership actually does care about self-preservation, and an escalation in fall of 2023 would have been a genuine risk to the current Iranian government. Not only would Iran getting directly involved have made themselves a target of Israeli bombers and missiles, but it would almost certainly have dragged the United States of America into getting directly involved. As it was, the Biden administration had deployed the carrier group centered on the USS Gerald R. Ford as their own deterrent, a signaling of intent, if you will. But US involvement aside, one thing I never hear anyone talk about when it comes to Israel's military capabilities are their nuclear arsenal. Now, the Israeli government's official position basically amounts to, what nuclear arsenal? But it is an open secret that they have somewhere between 90 and 400 nuclear warheads. That nuclear arsenal is why military force can't end the state of Israel, in the same way that military force can't end Russia. If the state's existence itself is threatened, the big red button is there to enact mutually assured destruction. So Iran wanted to avoid a further escalation against Israel because their leadership knows a direct military confrontation cannot be won. In addition, when it comes to Hezbollah specifically, that group is Iran's deterrent against an Israeli first strike. That's what the 100,000 rockets Iran has supplied Hezbollah is for, to act as their own form of mutually assured destruction. So, Iran prevented Hezbollah from getting more actively involved after October 7th, 2024, not only to prevent broader escalation, but also to prevent Israel from taking out Iran's deterrent. Now, for those that have been following the conflict from the beginning, I'm sure you are remembering that there were, in fact, military exchanges between Iran and Israel in 2024. That stems from the tit-for-tat strikes between Axis of Resistance members and Israel. I said before that multiple members of this axis were actively firing rockets and drones into Israel after October 7th. It should not be surprising that Israel would respond in kind. In addition, because these various non-state actors are actively supported militarily and sometimes financially by Iran, Israel would hold Iran responsible and view them as a legitimate target. In December 2023 and January 2024, multiple Iranian military commanders were killed in Israeli strikes, though Israel did not claim responsibility. It isn't unusual in this type of proxy conflict for these types of strikes to take place, and with plausible deniability, it isn't unusual for there to be a lack of a significant response, especially when one or both sides are trying to avoid escalation. But then, on April 1st, 2024, Israel hit an Iranian consulate building in Damascus, Syria. This was controversial in that it was a potential violation of diplomatic immunity. On the other hand, there is evidence that Iran was using the building in question for non-diplomatic purposes, which would void its diplomatic immunity status. Regardless, this type of a strike is the kind of thing that Iran was going to respond to, with rockets, not words, and the Israeli government had to know it. So on April 13th, Hezbollah launched a rocket barrage on Israel, and then overnight, on April 13th and 14th, coordinated strikes were launched from Iran itself, as well as other Axis of Resistance members. Over 300 drones and ballistic missiles in total. The Israeli retaliatory strike was relatively measured, hitting a military base, radar site, and air defenses near Isfahan International Airport in Iran. The scale of this attack and Iran's lack of a response indicated both sides were attempting to de-escalate the situation. And that is a weird thing about this type of proxy conflict, a military strike showing intention to de-escalate. International affairs is complicated, but this boils down to when you get pushed on the field, i.e. your consulate gets airstriked, even if you don't want open war, you do have to respond, otherwise it invites additional escalation from the opposition. But if you have responded with a large counterstrike, which 300 drones and ballistic missiles qualifies in this context, the opposition also can't take that without their own response. The much smaller scale of the reply is a signal to you that your opposition doesn't want to escalate further. It is therefore safe for you to not respond. Throughout the rest of the year, there continued to be rocket attacks from Hezbollah, Houthi, and other Axis of Resistance members not named Iran, and Israel continued to strike back, particularly in Lebanon and Syria. This is where we can start circling back to what this video is about, how the attack by Hamas against Israel led to Bashar al-Assad's fall in Syria. These back-and-forth strikes between groups in Lebanon and Syria in particular was having the effect of weakening Iranian capabilities of supporting Assad in Syria. Every Israeli strike that destroyed infrastructure or took out a military commander meant that infrastructure and leadership wasn't available to support Assad. The final domino that was knocked over was the September 2024 decision by Israel to implement a new war goal: the return of Israeli civilians to their homes in northern Israel. Large swaths of the north had been evacuated of civilians for nearly a year because of Hezbollah rocket attacks. To neutralize Hezbollah's capabilities, Israel launched a string of military operations within Lebanon. The first took place on September 17th, the detonation of thousands of communication devices Israel had managed to sabotage and slip into the Hezbollah supply chain, wounding hundreds or thousands and killing 42. Almost all of the casualties being within the Hezbollah leadership chain. Less than a week later, Israel began a bombing campaign across Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon. Then, on September 27, 2024, Israel killed the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, in an airstrike at a Hezbollah bunker built underneath a residential building. The combination of lost leadership, lost military infrastructure, and then an Israeli invasion that started on September 30th crippled Hezbollah's military capabilities and their ability to respond. It was a month later, on November 27, 2024, that a coalition of Syrian opposition forces, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, launched a military offensive against Bashar al-Assad's government. What started as a regional operation quickly morphed into a national offensive. Aleppo fell in 2 days, Hama in a week, and Damascus was taken on December 8th as Assad fled the country. In short, the collapse of Assad's government took just 11 days. How? Because it turns out Iran and especially Hezbollah were critical supports for the Assad regime. Israel had just decimated Hezbollah's military and command structures, and it left Assad vulnerable, and the Syrian opposition took advantage. The only other force that would have intervened on Assad's behalf, Russia, well, they bogged themselves down in Ukraine from their special military operation, i.e., military invasion, back in 2022. They too weren't capable of intervening to save Assad, not that quickly. That is how Hamas's attack against Israel ultimately sowed regime change in Syria. Russian military support was off the table through their own military blunder in Ukraine. Iran's direct military support to Assad was largely through their proxy forces. Hamas's attack on Israel, while not fully committing the axis of resistance, had the effect of making them acceptable targets in the eyes of the Israeli military in their war against Hamas, especially since the axis of resistance kept shooting at them. The final crippling blow against Hezbollah was the last major outside military force that was keeping Assad in power after decades of brutal oppression. This outcome was potentially foreseeable, but I acknowledge I didn't see it coming, even with all of my years of playing Europa Universalis 4. This is an event that I think is important when understanding foreign policy, international relations, and geopolitics. It isn't unusual to misidentify the important structures of maintaining power. Though I am far from an expert, I had been following the Syrian civil war since the start and was aware of Hezbollah's critical involvement in shoring up Assad's regime. What I hadn't considered was that their existence was still critical to Assad staying in power. So it often is in the realm of international affairs. You can be aware of 9 out of 10 pillars of power for a particular state, all to suddenly learn that 10th one you weren't aware of was the most important support pillar of all. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you want to hear me talk about history and politics in the future, hit the subscribe and bell while you're at it. In the meantime, I already have several videos posted for you to enjoy or critique, and I invite your input in the comments below. Until next time, take care.